Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Damien, you're up this week.
Yes, sir.
What are you bringing to the table today?
I am so excited to be bringing our September book to the table for us today. The book is called...
Glad you remembered.
I remembered. The book is called Defund, Conversations Toward Abolition. It was written by Dr. Calvin John Smiley. Let me put some respect on his name. It was published back in May by our friends at Haymarket Books. Calvin John Smiley is a professor in the sociology department at Hunter College City, University of New York. And his work there focuses on issues related to race, inequality, social justice, law, critical criminology, penology and reentry, and actually also urban sociology. So I felt like when I read that, I was like, oh, this book is right up his alley. He's actually also written or co-edited a couple of other books that focus on the notion of abolition praxis through the lens of reentry, while this book that we read for today uses the lens of the defund movement to have that conversation. Mm-hmm. And, speaking of conversation, what's awesome about this book is it's mostly made up of conversations between Smiley and different abolitionist organizers and leaders reflecting on various aspects of the defund movement and how it has influenced abolition from their particular and respective perspectives and communities, areas of expertise, work. So I wanted to sort of just outline all of the chapters in this book. There's 7 of them, so it won't take me that long. Chapter 1 features Marisol LeBron and their conversation about policing, surveillance, and state violence perpetrating harm and violence against marginalized communities. Chapter 2 with Dan Berger is mostly about this idea of how and why abolition is a, quote, both and project, which is really fascinating. Chapter 3 with Zeli Imani is all about his vision and belief that, quote, community is a verb, which I really appreciated learning more about that concept. Chapter 4 with Oluyemi Olorin is about her experience as an abolitionist working from within the criminal punishment system as a public defender, which was a fascinating conversation. Chapter 5 features Jonathan Ilan discussing how music and creativity plays a role in the abolition movement, specifically in Europe. Chapter 6 is a conversation with Michael and Debbie Davis and their experience serving time as political prisoners for decades and their vision for what they call, quote, justice healing justice. And then last but not least was Chapter 7 with Jason Perez, focused on the potential of labor organizing to fight opportunism and the power of the defund movement to tackle the idea of surveillance capitalism and how abolition is the only way forward, which, of course, we believe in here on this podcast. So, yeah, those are the chapters. And then, of course, there was both an introduction and a conclusion as well. There was so much content in this incredible book and lots that we can talk about today. So I'm really excited to have this conversation. Where do you want to start, my friend?
Yeah, I thought this was a great book to learn from, particularly the different ways people view defund and what they brought to the conversations and their view of its viability and possibility as a strategy.
Yeah.
I thought that was really great.
Yep.
The conversations helped clarify what defund means to different people.
Right.
And one of my favorite points came from Calvin John Smiley's introduction, where he says, quote, defund calls for economic and social justice by demanding the reallocation of money and resources away from police and other punitive entities and into other areas of the community, such as housing, healthcare, and education. At root, defund is not a radical idea, but a practical one, championing the dream that lies at the heart of Black Lives Matter, a world where Black lives have the resources they need to flourish. Which I love because it helped reframe some things.
Yes.
Defund is considered a radical idea, but only because right now the idea of taking money away from police budgets seems radical.
Right.
Because of how we've internalized across the United States and other places around the world that the only way to create public safety is with the police.
Right.
And so if that's the only way to create public safety, of course we have to fund them with whatever they need.
Yes.
Even if that's tanks.
Yeah. Us.
But we know from all of the different articles and books and reports and documentaries and things we've read on this podcast that there are lots of other ways to create safety. And funding those ideas is not inherently radical. It's a practical one.
It is.
I think, as Smiley says here.
Absolutely.
So I love the way he set that up as a foundational thesis for the rest of the conversations of this isn't a radical idea, it's a practical one. We're taking money from this overwrought budget that has too much in it and too much bloat and moving it into places where we can see an actual difference in a way that we create safety for the public in different ways.
Absolutely. I appreciate your point there about how this is a radical idea because it's all we know. It's all we've known in so many ways. And yeah, I really appreciated that introduction chapter and this idea of him setting the tone for the conversations that he was going to engage in this book and the journey we were going to go on, and to make sure we were all operating from the same understanding right out of the gate. And so a lot of that introduction is talking about defining defund, which I think is so important. And, he defines the defund moment and movement in a few ways in that introduction chapter. So early in that chapter, he says, quote, "For some, it is about the reallocation of public funds away from the police and other punitive carceral systems, such as jails, prisons, and surveillance technology, and into social welfare programs that provide care, stability, and community. Here, defund is simply a pragmatic and programmatic public policy shift of resources, which is within the power of elected officials and lawmakers. For others, defund is part of a larger legacy of struggles for racial justice, gender equality, and working class power." And I really appreciated that dichotomy there of how defund is both this practical thing and tangible actions. Yep. And it's also this goal, right? And movement and vision. I think that's a great way to think about it.
Yeah.
And he also talks about the ways in which reformers and abolitionists interact within that dichotomy and approach defund. And I think if folks are using this book as a way to explore abolition and learn more about it and figure out where they stand, I think all of that is really a helpful way for folks to do that. But in the end, one of the ways he sums all of this up in this introduction, and we're going to move away from this introduction in a second here, but he says, quote, "Ultimately, defund gives us a platform and pathway to reimagine a society with less police, more care, and services that meet the needs of all."
Exactly.
And, not only I think is that spot on, but I just think it's the only way forward for our society to be the place that we all need it to be.
Yeah, because he talks about the practicality of it, but also the ways that it allows us to create a vision of something beyond what we know.
Yes.
And I think that the practicality side of it helps ground that, like, there's money for these things that we're told there isn't money for, because that money exists. It's just being used in this way.
For this way, in this purpose. Yeah.
That means that we can dream because the resources are there. They're just not in the right spot.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I love that dichotomy, you call it, or like the dynamic between these two pieces of the concept of defund. One of my other favorite passages in the book is a critique of the analysis, I think, that I've internalized over the course of my understanding and learning of the through line from enslavement to Jim Crow to mass incarceration, as sort of three distinct eras of history in the United States. And the idea that I think I've internalized and a lot of folks have is that people's labor is what's being controlled. But in reality, that's one manifestation of a bigger dynamic of these systems.
Yes.
So Dan Berger says, in Abolition as a both-and project, quote, "Labor is not the connection that some have argued. The through line of incarceration that connects to slavery is captivity. People's lives and sense of self-determination is contained and confined by forces outside of their control. Slavery was about the master-slave relationship that was approved by the state. Imprisonment is this kind of machine that moves people from arrest to incarceration that reshapes their relationship with the state. It is this sense of captivity that connects the deeply entrenched infrastructure of slavery with its afterlives in the form of mass incarceration that is informed by racism, which has been the entirety of U.S. existence."
Wow.
So that, I think, reframed a lot of how I think I've learned what that through line is.
Yes.
For history. So the history of white supremacy is a history of control. We've talked about that here a lot. And it's confinement.
Yes.
in captivity. And yes, that resulted in the labor of Black people being controlled and exploited, but only because of the confines of the system of white supremacy. Like that was an extra piece of it.
Yes.
And Dan Berger uses the word captivity here, and I think that connects everything.
Yes.
Enslaved people were held captive. Jim Crow segregation created new realities of captivity within a so-called freedom.
Yep.
And this era of mass incarceration moves people into literal captivity.
Wow.
And I just appreciate that reframing because I think it helps shift us from I think exploiting people's labor and understanding the process that happens and is a very critical component of understanding critiques of capitalism and critiques of economic stuff. But not everything can be put into that box.
Right. It's
And
more
I
than
think-
that.
Yeah,
Yes.
it is that, but it's also beyond that. And there are economic drivers that created enslavement and then reinforced enslavement, but it was also reinforced by all of these other systems of white supremacy that influenced that in ways that I think, European colonialism started in Europe, and that system was not the same as it was when they came here and colonized this land and brought people over against their will to this land as a part of that process as well. So, yeah, I appreciated that shift in understanding what the exploitation was about, and it's about captivity. It's not just about people's labor.
Yeah, the captivity piece was really is key there in that and sort of the through line of those errors, as you call them, in our history. And yeah, I appreciated that learning from Dan Berger as well. There's a lot to learn from that chapter in particular in their conversation and this idea of the both and project.
Yeah.
One of the pieces I highlighted from that chapter was this quote: "Much of my work examines the carceral state and why it is bad, particularly how it is a tool of political and social repression. More importantly, the carceral state cannot solve the problems it claims to resolve, but only respond to the problems it has created. This is important to abolition, and I'm inspired by restorative and transformative justice as well as mutual aid collectives because abolition is a both-and project rather than an either-or mission. It is a rejection of these dichotomous or binary zero-sum approaches. We are not going to solely mutual aid ourselves to abolition, but mutual aid is certainly a component of abolitionism. Therefore, to sustain abolition, we need to fight on all fronts. This might mean mutual aid, fighting to free people from prison, stopping further prison construction, defunding the police, engaging in restorative and transformative justice practices, engaging in local politics, and collectives such as growing our own food and community gardens. It also means fighting for things like universal health care and nuclear disarmament. All this becomes part of the both-and strategy toward abolition because none of these things happen in isolation. Another part of an abolitionist strategy is transforming ourselves. How do we grow our own capacity to prevent harm, respond to conflict and deal with conflict in non-punitive ways, prevent state violence, and strategically organize?
Yeah.
And so all of that analysis is just brilliant, right? Yeah, and talking about what abolition is and what it can do for us. But I really go back to one of the first things he says in that and his comments about the carceral state. And the carceral state, as we know, is this huge entity, this huge apparatus that encompasses so much. But what he's talking about there is how it's this vicious cycle. The carceral state creates problems that it claims to solve, which only continues and deepens said problems. And that's just not what we need at all. So there's so much brilliance in there. But once I saw that piece, I was like, yes, I'm sold. Like that's absolutely like spot on analysis about what this is.
Yeah, and I love naming that it's creating problems and then claiming to solve the problems, but
Right.
it's really not even solving the problems that it
No,
creates.
not at all.
If it did, then the problems wouldn't continue to exist in that way, and then our relationship to the system would change.
Yeah. And my goodness, maybe one day we would need this.
Yeah.
If you actually were solving the problems, we wouldn't need you. So, and that's a part of the issue. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was great. That chapter was obviously great. We both talked about it.
Yeah.
Another concept that I love learning a little bit more about is described in the Defund Saved Us chapter where Jason Perez says, quote, "I subscribe to radical flank theory, which is the idea that if you want to get a liberal policy accomplished, you must be at the razor edge of the most radical aspect of an idea. Therefore, whatever the end goals, you must utilize a revolutionary vision without compromise. The problem is that we continually ask for the bare minimum, such as some on the left even questioning if defund is plausible. Of course, defund can happen, and we should be demanding it relentlessly if we want to have any sort of liberation or even substantive reforms." And I love this concept because I think it helps us understand that seemingly ridiculous demands of government are actually tied into a strategy of getting something less radical passed. It's a backdoor into getting something done that may not be everything we want, but it's a step in the right direction.
Yes.
And I think defund is a great example of this as an idea because people hear defund and they think like literally defunding a police or jail budget to zero like next year.
Right.
But what organizers are asking for is actually incremental and reasonable. It's practical.
Yes.
As Smiley described it early on, and we talked about, it's meeting basic needs with public funds for a piece of government where spending has actually exceeded its usefulness, and we're spending on things that aren't necessary or useful.
Right.
Cough, cough, cop city, cough.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I appreciated that concept. I don't know if it's the radical flank theory. Like, I don't know if that's something he coined, Jason Perez, or if it exists elsewhere. But like this idea that you have to be, I love that word, razor edge of the most radical aspect of an idea.
Yeah.
Right. And figuring out like, this is how we get there and this is how we make this happen was a really fascinating sort of concept to me to read about and to learn about.
He did not coin it.
He did not coin it, but he talks about it in this chapter. That's good. I'm glad we can, make sure we're giving out right information here. But yeah, and you're right. This idea that, it's not taking the monies, all of it, and redirecting it. There's a strategy here, and there's a plan here for what defund is and what abolitionists and organizers are aiming for here, which is really the point of all of this.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, we're starting to talk a little bit about application here. So let's turn our conversation there and talk about how this book and our conversation about it apply to our everyday lives and work. I think one of the biggest takeaways from this book that's made clear over and over again through all of these conversations is just how powerful defund is, especially as a critical step towards abolition.
Yeah.
And I believe this deeply, and I've said it many times in this podcast. I believe abolition is the only way we will achieve collective liberation, where all of us will be free to live and free to live well. And so I wanted to share Smiley's reflections on his takeaways from all of these conversations, which he talked about in the conclusion of this book. He says, quote, "In each interview, the through line is clear. Together we can build a better world. Indeed, each chapter highlights that we have the tools, resources, and theory to provide for all beings, care for the planet, and envision spaces that prioritize care over harm. While change may take time, motivated and inspired struggle moves us collectively toward abolitionist futures, and defund becomes an important catalyst for this process. Ultimately, abolition does not stop at dismantling the current system. Rather, it begins by creating a world that reduces stratification and violence, constructing new systems that are not predicated on retribution, exploitation, and profit, but rather motivated by reconciliation, care, and mutual aid. Complementarily, defund provides the blueprint for shifting resources, budgets, and tools into abolitionist spaces."
Yeah.
And I just felt like when I read that, I was like, well, I couldn't have said that any better. This idea that we have what we need here. And I truly believe defund and abolition are the only way to make that a reality. We have what we need. We just need to shift what we're doing to make that a reality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's such a great vision for where we can go and what defund means and what abolition ultimately could look like.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my application comes from the conclusion as well.
Okay.
John Calvin Smiley is quoting Dylan Rodriguez, who said that abolition is, quote, "an art form, the kind of creative truth that mixes the stuff of history into memory, survival, breath, and stubborn, vexed, and often nourishing community that constantly escapes the guarantees of an organizing plan. And Smiley puts it slightly differently, and to sum that up, and says, quote, abolition not only embraces the imaginative, it is imagination.
Yes.
And we have to have imagination to create the world we deserve, to do the things that you just talked about. There's imagination every step of the way.
Every step of the way.
It's infused throughout because we only know what we know.
Right.
And to create things that we don't know, that takes thought, it takes vision, it takes imagination.
Yes.
And we can't fall into this trap that it's always been this way. We can't fall into that trap because the reality is it hasn't always been like this for everybody.
Right.
There are plenty of ideas and histories of societies where justice isn't just punishment and where confronting people in crisis isn't met with violence. So we can imagine and create new systems because these systems that we're living in now were also imagined and created.
Yes.
Which means we can undo them and we can build new things that actually meet people's needs based on what it is that they need.
Yes. Yes. I love that. Well, and what I particularly love about what you said there was, this is a trap and we can't fall into that trap because it hasn't always been this way. But I think even beyond that, not only has it not always been that way, it isn't working, right?
Yeah.
What we have is not working. What we have is killing people, is literally killing people. It's separating people from their family. It's the captivity piece. It's killing people. And that isn't it. Like, that ain't it. And so I also just love the idea that, and Dylan Rodriguez's words there about it being an art form. And I think there's beauty in that. And I think whatever way we can get folks engaged in this idea of abolition, calling it an art form, calling it imaginative, thinking about it as something we can dream up, however we can get there and get folks on board, I appreciate. Absolutely. So that's good stuff. Let's talk about homework. How are we going to continue our learning and unlearning work, as you always say so brilliantly, once we leave this table today? For me, I really enjoyed this book. I wish we could have talked about more of the chapters in it and the conversations in it, but I appreciated this one, and so it made me think that we should read his other books as well. So his co-edited book from 2020 is called Prisoner Reentry in the 21st Century, Critical Perspectives of Coming Home. And his 2023 book is called Purgatory Citizenship, Reentry, Race, and Abolition. So I'd love to check out both of those books. Some of his other work has been featured in publications like The Washington Post and The Guardian, so it'd be good to read that work as well. And then one of the other things Calvin did in this book, was he mentioned two of Angela Davis's books in the introduction, Are Prisons Obsolete? And Abolition Democracy, Beyond Empire's Prison and Torture. And at this point, I think both are 20 years old, but it just reminded me when I saw that, I was like, oh, right, those are books on the list to read as well. So that's 4 books right there. I'm claiming as homework, which is just crazy, but I'd love to just check them out. Yes. What about you?
Well, make it 5.
Oh boy. Okay.
The book that stuck out to me that I wanted to read was mentioned in the conversation with Dan Berger, and it's called Until We Reckon: Violence, Mass Incarceration, and a Road to Repair by Danielle Sered. And it is about transformative and restorative justice, and was mentioned, as I said in that conversation, abolition as a both-and project.
Yes.
The book is about ways we can, quote, reconsider the purposes of incarceration, and argues persuasively that the needs of survivors of violent crime are better met by asking people who commit violence to accept responsibility for their actions and make amends in ways that are meaningful to those that they have hurt, none of which happens in the context of a criminal trial or a prison sentence.
Wow.
So it is a reimagining of the ways that we hold people accountable for the things that they do. And I think it sounds very powerful and sounds like something that we should learn about and unpack more on our little show here.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like we've talked about restorative justice and transformative justice a lot in a lot of the things that we've consumed here for the podcast, but we haven't delved into something specifically about it. So I think you should add that to the list and move it up towards the top. I think that'd be a great book. I think I missed that in that chapter. So I would love to read that. Very good. All right, we got some good homework here. And what a great conversation, folks. I definitely encourage you to check out this book. It was incredible, and I learned so much from it. So
Yep.
thank you, Calvin John Smiley, for such a great book. Well, you're up next time, my friend.
I am. Yeah.
What are you going to bring for our next episode?
I'm bringing a documentary
Okay.
called Let the Fire Burn, Tragedy in Philadelphia, which is about the city of Philadelphia's attack on the MOVE organization that happened in 1985. So this is from the description of the documentary. A long-time feud between the city of Philadelphia and controversial radical urban group MOVE came to a deadly climax. By order of local authorities, police dropped military-grade explosives onto a MOVE-occupied row house. TV cameras captured the conflagration that quickly escalated and resulted in the tragic deaths of 11 people, including 5 children, and the destruction of 61 homes. It was only later discovered that authorities decided to let the fire burn. And so I wanted to bring this because a couple of the people who are in this book, Michael and Debbie Davis, were part of MOVE.
Yes.
And were political prisoners for a long time after the city of Philadelphia attacked them. And so I just felt like we should learn some more about that moment and MOVE. And this was a great time to do that. And I found this documentary and was like, oh, well, let's watch this. It's about 10 years ago. It's also described as a found footage documentary.
Okay.
So people put together the story based on news coverage from 1985, 6, 7, like the late 80s when the news was covering this. And when there was, it looks like in the trailer, it looks like council hearings and different things.
Okay.
So there are interviews that they're taking and telling the story with footage that wasn't current when they were making the film.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's so fascinating. I asked you what you were going to bring, and folks, he teased it a little bit. All he said was it's a documentary and stay tuned. And so he had me in suspense for a few hours here. But yeah, I'm excited to check that out. When I read that chapter and the conversation with Michael and Debbie, it made me think. I mean, I went to college in Philadelphia, but I know nothing about this incident and what happened. And to hear them talk about their story and their family and rebuilding their family and reconnecting with their family after spending decades in prison was a really moving story. And to think about what happened to them with this was really heartbreaking. So yeah, I'm excited to check this out. Where can folks find this documentary?
I found it on Canopy.
Oh, yes. Okay, great.
Get on with your local library card.
Yes.
In most places.
Yes.
So Canopy with a K.
Canopy with a K.
Yeah.
Very good. All right. Well, I'm looking forward to that one. Very good. All right, folks. Well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life, follow us on social media, including Instagram and TikTok. Check us out over on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.